Wapato, The Human History of Starchy Tubers. This is Obesity Explained, episode 10. We're going to look at a lot of pretty flowers today, and we're really featuring arrowhead tubers, also known as Wapato by Native Americans. Um, and in this episode, so I teased in the last episode that I was going to make the case for starch. This is actually split into a two-part episode because I just have too much to say about it to keep it to one episode. In this one specifically, I'm going to talk about the human history and our interaction with starchy tubers and how those have affected essentially the whole time frame of humanity. And I'm going to start with the case that is often made, especially by people in the keto community or the paleo community, against the idea that we should be eating a lot of starchy tubers such as potatoes. And I'm going to pick on Mark Sisson. I think Mark Sisson's a good guy. I've certainly enjoyed a lot of his writing over the years, and I think he's helped a lot of people. But I think in this particular case, I disagree with him. And so a lot of the argument made against tubers is that they're a fallback food. And what's a fallback food? Well, the idea is that okay, so if you're a band of hunting nomads, right? You're these Paleolithic hunting nomads and you're out and maybe the hunt fails, right? And what you really want is you want a mammoth, but you didn't catch a mammoth. And so you have to fall back and eat starchy tubers. And this is actually used, this idea of fallback foods is used by people who study other primates, monkeys and orangutans. And the idea is that a chimpanzee, their preference is to have ripe fruits, right? Ripe, sugary fruits. But as a fallback, they will eat, leaves if they have to. Definitely not their preference. It's not the best nutrients for them. But it's a fallback, right? You can still have something to eat. And so Mark argues that, one or the second point here, they were very likely fallback food. So hunter gatherers, on game-rich lands will have more opportunities to consume the preferred animals and less cause to fall back on fibrous tubers. So, at every opportunity, hunter-gatherers will consume high-quality meats versus low-quality tubers. And he says fibrous tubers. And to that point, the first thing he says here is wild tubers are not russet potatoes. They don't generally turn into the creamy, smooth, starchy goodness when baked. They're tough, fibrous things that provide a fraction of the usable energy modern cultivars provide. And a lot of that reason is that the hunter-gatherer cultures that we can observe, such as the Hadza in Africa, are in really marginalized land, and they just simply do not have access to high quality tubers. The tubers that they have are fibrous, but we can't generalize that just because the particular tubers that are available to the Hadza are fibrous. And right, what they do is they kind of chew on them and extract the juices, and then they spit out the fibers, right? But that is not necessarily what every wild tuber is like in the world. And he also says that we make something called salivary amylase, which is an enzyme that allows us to digest starch into simple sugars in your mouth. And that part, I absolutely agree with him. And there's been this gene duplication event in humans where we have more copies of the salivary amylase gene than our ancestors did. And that's very interesting. And he says that, but compared to the fruit eating and starch eschewing chimpanzees with two copies, humans have between 2 and 15 copies of the salivary amylase gene. And so he's making the argument here that our gaining extra copies of salivary amylase wasn't too long ago because the chimpanzees don't have these extra copies of amylase. And so this must have happened very recently evolutionarily. And so maybe we're not really that well adapted to starch yet. And furthermore, this is another thing I've heard people talk about is a lot of tubers are also toxic. And so societies have had to go a long way to figure out how to deal with this toxicity. And of course, one of the tools that humans have is fire and the ability to cook things. And so, cassava, also known as manioc, is one of the most widely grown crops in the world of anything, but especially one of the most widely grown tuber crops in tropical countries. And raw cassava contains cyanide, which is obviously toxic, and so it is very important that you thoroughly cook your cassava. And there's a bitter cassava too, which is hardier and easier to grow and has less pest resistance, but it is much more cyanide. So it is very important if you're going to eat bitter cassava to fully cook it. This is a story about the ancient domestication of potatoes, just regular potatoes. Potatoes are very toxic. They're high in these glycoalkaloids. And the Peruvians noticed that the animals would eat clay and they would eat the potatoes and they would be okay. And so the ancient Peruvians learned to dip the potatoes into clay, and then they could eat some of them. And over time, they developed less toxic varieties, right? And so if that's how all tubers are, you can't just wander around eating tubers, right? It takes a long time to develop high quality, non-toxic tubers. Early peoples would not have just been able to wander around and find high quality tubers, right? That is sort of the case against the idea that tubers are a natural native food of humans. Yams, another one of our domesticated tubers. There are 600 plants in the yam species. Essentially 600 of them are toxic, but there are 12, according to this, that are not toxic. And so we've had to, somehow know in a jungle of 100, any given local jungle, you might have 25 toxic species of yam and one species that isn't toxic. And how do you know? And so another argument that he makes is that, potatoes are very dense, and even if we did find tubers that weren't toxic and weren't that fibrous, we wouldn't get the same sort of density of nutrition as we'd have in a potato. I say if that matters. What I mean is to obesity. I'm not sure if it matters the density of the starch that you eat, but that's a topic for another day. So I made this chart of caloric density of just the common starches. These are all things you know about, right? So we've got carrots, sweet potatoes, yams, white rice, taro, that's from the Pacific Islands. This is cooked pasta, and this is manioc or cassava. And so you can see this is calories per 4 ounce. And you can see that actually potatoes in the world of sort of normal domestic starches are actually not that dense. They're maybe half as dense as cooked pasta, calories per 4 ounces. And a lot of these crops like yams and taro are actually more similar to the caloric density of white rice or pasta. And cassava or manioc is off the charts. This is like the cooked manioc, and these are all in the cooked form. These are all boiled. And manioc is an absolute very dense source of starch. And then, he makes the argument that we must have only recently gotten this salivary amylase, and we've only just started eating starch. And so this is a list of, this is a bunch of different animals, as you can see. Whales, we got, this looks like a horse, caprines, those are goats, right? And this is the number of copies of this salivary amylase gene that they have. And what you can see is that this is an interesting one. This is a wolf, and this is a cat or a lion. And wolves and, carnivores don't have, they only have just the normal copy number of salivary amylase. They don't have a lot of salivary amylase activity. But the domestic dog has a bunch of copies because dogs have been hanging out around people and they've had access to starch. And so they have this growth in the number. And interestingly, grazing animals also don't have salivary amylase because grass doesn't have starch. And I've got a couple slides coming up. Just quick go through where do we actually find starch in nature. You can see pigs, right? Pigs dig and they eat tubers, and they have a lot of copies of this. Rodents collect and eat grass seeds and acorns, right? So they have a lot of copies of salivary amylase. And interestingly, all of the higher order primates also have several copies of the salivary amylase gene, although humans have the most. But it is very high. It is very variable between individuals of humans, and depending on what population you're from, how many copies of it you have. And so I just want to think about this second. Why might these primates have uh, this need to digest starch? And so, where do we get starch? Well, certain tubers, primates are known to use tubers at times, and I'll show some evidence of that. Not all tubers. A carrot is a USO, an underground storage organ. I'm going to use the words tuber and bulb and corm sort of interchangeably, and rhizome, although they're all technically a little bit different. Anyways, not all tubers are starchy. Beet is a tuber that is not starchy. It has sugar, not starch, right? Carrots don't have starch; they have sugar. Some seeds, of course, have starch. Grass seeds, famously, wheat and corn are grass seeds. Also, chestnuts, acorns, right? A lot of mass crops. And interestingly, breadfruit seeds. And there is an African breadfruit tree that makes seeds that are starchy seeds in Africa. So that's interesting. That could possibly be a place where primates are getting starch. But also unripe fruit, right? Plantains. Think about a green plantain. If you've ever had plantain chips are made of starch, right? That is a fruit. Mangoes, when they're unripe, have a lot of starch. And then when they ripen, that starch converts to sugar. Baobab, you may have heard of if you're familiar with the Hadza. Baobab is a fruit that has edible seeds, and though those seeds are encased in a pulp that is a sweet pulp that's the meat of the fruit, and I've got some data on that. But the unripe baobab pulp is a pretty high source of starch as well. That would have been an African source of starch. And so just quick, looking at this again, you can see, right, and so yeah, horses, right, or cattle are not right. They're neither eating grass seed nor acorns nor unripe fruit, right? They're just eating grass, and so they don't need that salivary amylase. Obviously, wolves and cats don't need salivary amylase. But interestingly, it seems that primates do. So humans come from all of our closely related species do have a lot of copies of the salivary amylase gene. And this is really where the rubber hits the road. So this is a test where you take a little bit of saliva, you make this plate, and this has starch in it. Then you take a little bit of saliva, ideally the same amount, and you have a way to measure this, from a chimpanzee and a gorilla and a baboon and a human and a lemur, which is a primate, but it's one that we're a little further related, or a little further away related from. That's not great English. I'll roll with it. Marmoset and capuchins are other primates that we're less closely related to than we are to chimpanzees and gorillas. And you can see that all of us have, humans, baboons, and rhesus monkeys have very high levels of salivary amylase. Gorillas have almost the same amount, but chimpanzees have a lot, right? Compared to lemurs and some of these other things. So chimpanzees clearly are making a lot of salivary amylase. And humans are closely related to chimpanzees. And so I don't particularly agree with Mark's assertion that if humans have high salivary amylase activity, this happened very recently after we diverged from the other high order primates. They also have a lot of salivary amylase. Kind of said that already. Also, I've been talking in the past few episodes about grizzly bears and how grizzly bears use their big claws to dig up and eat tubers and roots. And this paper shows that indeed this AMY1B is the salivary amylase in bears. And you can follow that up, and the fact that this yellow is a little bit darker than the same vertical line in the polar bears or in the black bears says that grizzly bears who eat a lot of roots have more copies of the salivary amylase gene. And then finally, do chimpanzees, as Mark suggests, really eschew starch? I didn't know I was going to get to use the word eschew until I read his article. Anyway, so this paper, um, savanna chimpanzees use tools to harvest the underground storage organs of plants. That's interesting. This is a phrase, USOs, that you see in the literature. That just means geophytes is another one. That's just under those both just mean corms, tubers, bulbs, things that are underground that have starch, potentially have starch and sugar in them. And so in this paper, they found a lot of examples of chimpanzees using tools, using sticks to dig bulbs and tubers out of the ground. And interestingly, they were doing it during the rainy season, well after the period of most likely food shortage, which actually contradicts the idea that for chimpanzees, tubers are necessarily a fallback food. They were harvesting the tubers when they didn't necessarily have to, so that's interesting. Um, and this I referenced before, the baobab, and so chimpanzees, it turns out, really like these baobabs, and at certain times of the year, that's most of their diet. And so they looked, and they looked at the parts. This is the parts of the baobab, right, that they're not eating, that's discarded, and they saw that they eat the seed kernels and the pulp. And although they prefer the ripe baobab, if all there is unripe baobab, they will eat that as well. And you can see they were actually eating more of the unripe baobab fruit and pulp than they were eating of the ripe. And if you look at the composition of that unripe baobab, it is about 14% starch by weight. And interestingly, that is with 2/3 water content. So if you were to take that pulp and you were to dry it, it would be about 40% starch. And that starch would be not a massive percentage of the diet of these chimpanzees, but my guess is it'd be 10 to 15% of their caloric intake, and that's something, right? And lastly, if you take wild chimpanzees, and if they have access to agricultural products such as cassava or manioc, they do indeed eat it. And so obviously this is unnatural, but given access to starch, chimpanzees do eat it. And lastly, bonobos are as closely related to us as chimpanzees, roughly. And bonobos occasionally consume plants that are high in starch, such as the seeds of African breadfruit, which contain up to 30% starch, and the pith of terrestrial herbs, such as that thing, which contain about 40% starch. Okay, so let's move on to humans. Humans, it turns out, have been roasting tubers and eating them since way back then. And of course, when we roast starchy tubers, we can actually absorb a lot more of the nutrients from them than if we were to eat them raw. And a lot of people have speculated that the ability to roast tubers has one of the things that has helped us to grow our big brains. And so this paper came out in 2020. And this is this paper is amazing to me. They go to this cave in South Africa, and they find in the ash 170,000-year-old roasted starchy tubers. This is the plant down here, and you can see that. So this is the tuber cut, right. They cut it this way, and this is the bottom of it, and you can see this whole pattern is matched in these in these little tubers, and this is one that they just dug, and it's about an inch across. And they go on to show, actually, here's the cave, right, that it came out of. Pretty cool cave, and in South Africa you can see that this is the opening in the cave, and this is like a fence that they have in place to keep riffraff out. Um, and this is the plant Hypoxis angustifolia. And over here, this is actually a or an electron microscope image of one of these tubers cut in half, and you can see these little dots, all these little blips. Those are actually starch granules, and so they show that indeed this Hypoxis angustifolia is a high starch, low fiber tuber. And this is a quote. Unfortunately, they don't report the exact amount of starch in the paper, but This is according to the author in a press release about it. Hypoxia rhizomes are nutritious and carbohydrate rich with an energy value of approximately 500 kilojoules per 100 grams. And of course, no one has any idea what that means, but I'll show you on the next slide. She says they're when raw, they're fibrous and have a high fracture toughness until you cook them, but the rhizomes are rich in starch and would have been an ideal staple plant food. Cooking the fiber-rich rhizomes would have made them easier to peel and to digest, so more of them could be consumed, and the nutritional benefits would be greater, says Wadley, who is the main author. And so I added this. Into our thing. I converted that number, and so these hypoxia rhizomes, according to the author, I can't find independent corroboration of this, but these are about as calorically dense as yams, which is to say significantly more calorically dense than potatoes, and almost as calorically dense as cooked white rice. And we were eating these in a cave in Africa 170,000 years ago, right? And so this is the great human diaspora. And so here we are in southern Africa where the first humans evolved, right? And so and of course all these numbers are hotly debated, the exact ages and all these things, but this cave, it was right here where I put this X, and this is 170,000 years ago, right? And so they're saying the first modern Homo sapien evolved sometime around 200,000 years ago in southern Africa. And here we are in South Africa 170,000 years ago in a cave cooking starchy tubers, right? 170,000 years ago. That is, if we find tubers 170,000 years ago, we were probably also cooking them, right? 185,000 years ago, maybe 250,000 years ago, right? What are the chances that we would find them? And so this to me is a stunning discovery. You can't really separate all these dates. It seems like, as far as we know, humans were probably cooking tubers from near the beginning. We had control of fire by 200,000 years ago. We knew how to cook, and we knew to dig up and cook these starchy tubers. That is my take-home message from this. Here's another recent paper. More cooked starchy tubers found in South Africa 120,000 years ago, 65,000 years ago, in this cave. And we have more electron micrographs of these. You can see these are clearly, they call them charred starch. These are clearly plant fibers. And so, we can add another dot here. Here's another cave in South Africa. So now, continuously from 170,000 years up to 65,000 years ago, it seems that we were cooking these starchy tubers. And so this woman, so this is a recent publication, November 2020, by this woman, Elzan Singles, from the University of Cape Town. Very interesting. This was her thesis. And they looked at all of these local geophytes, underground storage organs, corns, tubers, all these things. And they found that the nutritional quality of geophytes is high, even in comparison to domesticated crops such as potatoes. Geophyte resources on the coastal plain are dense and diverse. Geophytes could have been available during a large portion of the year. All Stone Age processing methods tested experimentally improved the nutritional quality of underground storage organs. And this is you should look up, if you're really interested in this subject, look up her paper. It's very interesting. There's all these photos. So they dug up these things called Watsonia, and Watsonia have been found in tons of archaeological remains with humans in caves, etc. And they sliced this up with this stone cutter that they made, showing that this could be done in the Stone Age. And one of the issues with Watsonia is it is a little bit tannic, and so they put it in this tide pool that was not connected to the ocean, so they couldn't wash away. And in a few hours, it turns red because the tannins are leaching out of these tubers. And so you can see it's very easy. It would have been very easy for people to remove the tannins. Here they are. They've got a couple more that they've collected that they're roasting. And this is actually after a Veldfire, which are these fires that happen in South Africa, and these are more Watsonia corms that they've collected, and you can see these burned ones were burned in the fire. Um, and it's pretty fun. But this is from another paper, and it says the often mass flowering of Watsonia and other geophyte species in the first year after a fire, and the South American fynbos, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, vegetation is well known. So, interestingly, whenever there's a fire, it says geophytes are prominent soon after a fire in all the heathlands of the world. So, whenever there's a fire, all of these flowering plants, it increases the amount of them. So one can imagine if one was a species that had learned to control the use of fire and that had learned to cook these tubers, one might be able to control the amount of tubers by setting more fires, right? And so, and she looks at all these old archaeological digs, and these are the most common species found in all these different digs. And you can see the Watsonia are very common. They're an iris. And by far the most common plants found in all these archaeological sites in South Africa, in the cradle of humanity, are irises. I also, in yellow, have this Dioscorea. That's a yam. I already talked about yams. We'll talk about yams again. But mostly right now we're going to look at irises. And so they collected all of these species. This is only like a third of the ones she has published in that paper. They collected all these species, and they looked at how much starch do they have, how much sugar, how much protein. This is a really great study. And so down to the bottom for reference, she has potatoes. So in yellow here, potatoes are about 15% starch, right? And this is just a wet raw potato. They're about 15% starch, and they have about 300 kilojoules per 100 grams, which is what I showed before. It's around 100 calories per 100 grams. It's a little bit less. It's like 80 calories per 100 grams. And these are irises here. This is the average iris that they found in Africa. It's actually more energy dense than a domestic potato, and it has about the same amount of starch, but it also has significant sugar. So it's a little more like a sweet potato. It has starch and sugar together, right? And this second column is fiber. So 2% fiber in the irises, 2% fiber in the potatoes. So the irises are not they're not fibrous. They're just as energy dense as potatoes, if not more. And if they have tannins, well, you can just simply leach the tannins away, right? It's not a problem, and they do not seem to be toxic. This one in yellow is one of the ones she showed in her journal, and that one's a little bit less energy dense. Okay, fine. This one here just jumped off the page, Babiana stricta, because the energy density is more than double what a potato is. It's up at and so that one just caught my eye, and I put it in here. And so I decided to put this one, right. This is that Babiana stricta that's off the charts. It's as calorically dense as cooked pasta and almost as dense as manioc. And this is a tuber that 170,000 years ago hunter-gatherers could have just collected and eaten. And so I don't think that Mark's supposition that wild harvested tubers would not have been nearly as energy dense as a potato. Also, interestingly, I Googled it. This is Babiana stricta. This is being sold by a nursery in California. You could just order some of these bulbs. You can see origin, South Africa. Yep, that is the right one. It's an iris. And it says this plant is bulb-like with a corm. Yep, that is absolutely right. So you could actually you could buy some of these and roast them up if you wanted to, or plant them. I'm sure they're nice flowers. And so these are some other things. And so, I put on here, this was just some other plants from these. This is the one that she mentioned in her study that she had found that they were roasting in that pit. They're a little less dense. They're down more closer to carrots. And this was kind of an average from there. And so, so these wild tubers run the range, but they're not less dense on average than potatoes. And so, okay, fine. we had access to these high quality tubers in Africa, but what happened after that? Maybe we abandoned them until we became Neolithic. Um, and so this is a paper that found evidence of starch grains from various wild plants on the surface of grinding tools at sites in Italy, Russia, and the Czech Republic. Um, these show signs of vegetable food processing was a common practice widespread across Europe from at least 30,000 years ago. Um, and one of the species that they found, or perhaps the main species that they found in these grindstones, is typha. Well, that is a cattail. Um, and it's, Native Americans made widespread use of cattails. People who are into like foraging wild plants know all about cattails. You can eat like every part of a cattail. Um, anyway, and so they show the fiber, or these cattail rhizomes are kind of fibrous. They're up at 17% fiber, but they do have a ton of digestible carbohydrates. And so this is a foraging website called Eat the Weeds, and they claim, and I have not verified these claims. They claim that no green plant produces more edible starch per acre than cattails, not potatoes, rice, taro, or yams. And that plans were underway to feed American soldiers with cattail starch when World War II stopped. I have no idea if that's true. Um, but they say to get the root starch, chop the roots into small pieces and then pound them with a little water. When the long fibers are removed, the resultant goop powder can be dried and used as flour. And that is presumably why these cattail starch granules are being found on grinding tools in Russia and Italy, because people are pounding them up to remove the starch and get rid of that fiber. And this is cattail distribution throughout the world. And you can see that if you can use cattail fiber or cattail starch as a source of calories, you can go a lot of places in the world and be just fine. Right, and so we can add a couple X's to our map of the Great Diaspora here in Italy and Czechia and Russia, and then we move on to China. So now, again, at least 20,000 years ago, perhaps 23,000 years ago, um, we find tools used to process various plants, including, like I say, yams. Diosauria. We see Diosauria again, like I said we would, and they say that Diosauria yams have been uncovered from chipped stone tools dated as far back as 28,000 years before the present. And this is a Chinese manuscript, so I was not able to double check this reference. But nonetheless, are these what are Chinese yams like? Are they toxic? Well, this was a study in Nepal. They collected these wild yams growing in Nepal, and they found that they were not toxic varieties. They did not contain either the toxic diascorin or histamine, and the cyanogen content was satisfactorily below the safety limits. The only issues with these wild yams were high levels of oxalates in these tubers, which are a problem for some people. But generally speaking, these yams could have been used as a high quality food in China. And so you can see that in these wild yams in Nepal, the crude fiber is the same as potatoes, and the energy density is the same or greater than potatoes. And so people in China 28,000 years ago, probably longer, would have been eating these tubers. And so we put another dot in the map 28,000 years ago in China. And that brings us to America as we follow this great diaspora. This is going to be the heart of the story. We've got an amazing story. First, we'll start out with a couple of plants. The Golden Club. So this is from Food Plants of the North American Indians by Dr. Havard of the U.S. Army. And she says the Golden Club is an aquatic perennial with a deep bulbous rootstock. Both the roots and the seeds were much prized by the Indians, and according to Peter Kalm, by some of the white colonists as well. So that is yet another high quality tuber. And the American lotus is very interesting, also known as the water chinkapin. The tubers are 5 to 10 inches long and weigh from 2 to 8 ounces, so that's a pretty good size tuber. And it says it has a pleasant, sweet, and mealy taste, much resembling that of the sweet potato. That's interesting, and this is a theme I'm going to come back to here. It says it was so far out of its range as to lead to the general supposition that the Indians brought and naturalized it in these local habitats. And that is very interesting, right? Because these are Paleolithic people. They're supposed to be hunting and gathering, not gardening, right? And so I just want to throw. So this is that same chart I showed before from that thesis, and she had lotus root on here as another comparison. So these are about as dense as a potato, and it's a mixture of starch and sugar. I can buy these at my local Asian market, Asian grocery store in Ithaca, and it's interesting. They said it tastes like a sweet potato, as it would, being a mixture of starch and sugar. And now we're getting really into the heart of American tubers. This is the American groundnut, Apios americana. The groundnut has an edible tubers strung along long subterranean shoots, varying in size from a nut to a hen's egg. They contain a large proportion of starch. This is a starchy tuber, and they taste like potatoes. This guy, Raffinisk, tells us that the plant was formerly cultivated by the Indians. Well, that's a very interesting. Again, we see signs of Native Americans actually growing these tubers, not just collecting them. And it says it must have been extensively used by the eastern and southern Indians, as all early explorers mention it, and some were saved by it from starvation. And this is in Lancaster, Massachusetts. So this woman, Mary Rowlandson, was taken as a captive by the Native Americans in a war started by King Philip in 1675, and she remained in their captivity for 11 weeks. And she said the chief and commonest food was groundnuts. And so that's very interesting. The Iroquois and other Native Americans in the Northeast used groundnuts. You can see the roots resemble potatoes and were boiled by the Indians, who eat them instead of bread. Some of the Swedes at that time likewise ate this root for want of bread, and some of the English still eat them instead of potatoes. And this is fascinating in the Paris documents of 1666, and that's a whole complicated story in and of itself. But it says the Iroquois are divided into 9 tribes, the 6th of which was and I'm not going to pronounce that word, the potato people. And the drawing is appended showing a string of potatoes as the tribe's totem. And there it is. This is the 1666 document, and this is this tribe, and you can see those are very clearly, these are the actual roots, and you can see they grow, or these tubers grow along these long roots, and there they are, standing for this Iroquois tribe in 1666, and an example of reality being stranger than fiction. Somehow in the I don't know how to pronounce this, Meiji period from 1868 to 1912, the American groundnut showed up in Japan, and it has become a culinary specialty of the Aomori Prefecture, where American groundnut agriculture is centered, and it has been eaten there for more than 100 years. So if you go to this place in Japan, it's the only place in the world where you can be served an American groundnut. Did Native Americans really spread these tubers? This is an aerial photograph of my farm 16,000 years ago, which was the time that the first humans stepped foot in North America. Obviously, this is a joke. 16,000 years ago was near the apex of the ice age, right? So my farm's in upstate New York. It would have been under a mile of ice the time that the first Native Americans got to the New World. And I bring that up because one of the questions, there's this long-standing mystery about the great distance that a lot of plants moved following the glacial retreat. And so this is called Reed's paradox. You see all of these plants that would not have moved north at a fast rate including species with highly limited dispersal abilities, such as woodland herbs, right? And so the suggestion is that Native Americans may well have helped move a lot of these plants along, move these plants north as the glaciers retreated. That would have been important to them. And I bring up this quote again about Apios americana, this groundnut that was so plentiful in New York and in New England, that that woman, when she was taken hostage by the Native Americans, they were able to live primarily off of those for 11 weeks. And all of the early explorers talk about them. And so, this quote is that they were formerly cultivated by the Indians, and I suspect that is why there were so many groundnuts. And by at least 12,000 years ago, we know that there were Native Americans in New York City, which is about a 4-hour drive from here. Of course, 12,000 years ago, I believe my farm still would have been under ice. By about 10,000 years ago, that ice would have been gone. And so people were here the whole time as those glaciers retreated, possibly planting groundnuts. We can't say. But we're going to move on to the main course now of this episode, Wapato. And this is observations of a Paleolithic tuber-based diet in America. And perhaps you're wondering how this is possible. And so the Pacific Coast tribes did not cultivate the soil and depended entirely on the spontaneous products of land and water, which is to say that the Pacific Coast tribes were truly Paleolithic. They were not farmers. It is remarkable that these tribes, although having more or less intercourse with the Missouri Indians on the east and the Pueblo Indians on the south, and always on the verge of starvation, failed to introduce and cultivate the maize or other vegetables. It's remarkable why, since they were all starving, why did they fail to grow maize and squash? And this is according to Valerie Havard, again, in her Food Plants of the North American Indians. And so this is my map of North America in 1492, and I've broken it up into the Neolithic areas of North America. And so, as we know, there were these large Neolithic civilizations, such as the Mayans and the Aztecs in Mexico. And Mesoamerica, Mexico, and Belize and Guatemala was the center of a huge number of domestications. That is where corn was domesticated, squash, beans, chilies, i.e. peppers, tomatoes, chocolate and vanilla, sweet potatoes, avocados, papayas, chewing gum, and turkeys were all domesticated right here. And there's a bunch of other things too that I left off. And also by trade with Brazil, they also had taro. There's a Native American version of taro. They also had an American version of yams, and they had cassava and manioc. And so this area, it was a really rich source of plant foods. And anyways, and so I call this area fully Neolithic because more than 70% of their calories were coming from CBS, by which I mean corn, bean, squash, which is to say more than 70% of their calories were coming from these Neolithic foods. And then this green area is what I call the transitional zone. So this is where the Iroquois lived, and the Eastland Woodland Indians and the Mississippian culture. And I call them translational because even though they were raising corn and squash and beans, if you read about the Iroquois and their life history, they were probably only getting about a third of their calories from those sources, and the rest of the calories would have been hunted and gathered. But then interestingly, as she pointed out in that previous passage, west and north of somewhere around Idaho, there are no corn, squash, and beans, and these Native Americans must have known that corn, squash, and beans existed in the world because there was huge trade networks between the whole country and all these Native Americans, but for whatever reason, they simply chose not to use those domesticated crops. And I just why did that pattern why does the pattern exist like that? And obviously the thing that drove the Neolithic transition in America was corn, right? Corn is an incredibly productive crop. It's easy to grow. It's easy to store. So it is a perfect crop to go to transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic. It was domesticated in Mexico. I say more than 6,500 years ago. It's probably more than 8,700 years ago. And it's a semi-tropical crop, and so it very quickly made its way all the way down to Brazil, right? And so it's in Brazil 6,500 years ago. This proto version of corn, not really true corn yet. And then by 4,000 years ago, it pops up in as far north as Arizona and New Mexico, but then it stalls out, right? The corn can't really move north until sometime before 2,000 years ago. A new variety of corn coming from Mexico's Pacific coast emerges, and that corn is more mobile. And by 2,000 years ago or so, it is in America, and by about 1,200 years or so ago, it's here, meaning New York State and New England. And so that's what sets up this pattern where the U.S. East Coast had really only gotten corn fairly recently because it didn't travel north well. Mexico was very Neolithic because they had had this very Neolithic crop for like 9,000 years probably, but the Pacific tribes had never embraced the corn. It was still kind of new, but also they had a lot of other resources available. And Lewis and Clark are going to set out from Illinois heading towards Oregon, and they're going to see exactly what those resources were. And now I'm going to introduce what is Wapato. It is the arrowhead tuber. This is another water-based plant. This is very widely distributed in North America, in the U.S., in Canada, also in Mexico, throughout Central America, and even into South America. So this plant is incredibly widely distributed. And in the Midwest, Native Americans would muskrat and beaver will collect these Wapato tubers. They're like little potatoes, and they make these big caches of them. And so the Native Americans would just watch for these muskrat and beaver caches, and they would just steal their potatoes from the muskrats and beaver, which is not very nice, but it saved them the trouble of actually even having to collect it from the wild. So that's pretty nice. Also, arrowhead tubers grow throughout Asia and into the Middle East and even parts of Europe. So this is indeed a very widely distributed, high quality potato like tuber. In this study, they did, they studied its composition, how much starch it had, how high quality it was, and this is in Taiwan. And interestingly, they just purchased it from the local market because in China, they have actually semi-domesticated arrowhead tubers, and you can just buy them. So anyway, he finds that this is indeed a high starch, low fiber, high quality tuber. And so Lewis and Clark are now approaching what is the modern day city of Portland. As they come across this Wapato the first time, they're going to mention the Dallas. I don't really know how you pronounce this. I'm also just pointing out there's a town here called Camas right outside of Portland, and we'll talk about Camas briefly too. And so this is another thesis written by Melissa Cole Darby in 1996. This is another really interesting read if you're interested in this kind of stuff. They do this quick analysis, and I just want to show again in the analysis that she presents, Wapato is again similar, very similar in overall quality of food to a potato. Camas and rice root we're going to touch on at the end. But you can see the same amount of carbohydrates as a potato, the same amount of calories. And so interestingly, this part of the Lower Columbia had one of the densest populations in America north of Mexico. And that was even after by 1805, they had already suffered through two epidemics. And this is an unfortunate thing. Obviously, these epidemics that swept through native populations. This was probably smallpox in 1775 and again in 1801. And even after the two epidemics, Lewis and Clark estimated the population from the Dalles, so that's where the Columbia River comes out of the foothills, to the mouth of the river, to be between 27,000 and 18,000 people, depending on whose estimate you use. There probably was seasonal variation. And like you say, if you got there before the two epidemics, we don't know. It could have been 60,000 people. And so November 4th, approaching the lower Columbia, Lewis and Clark come across Wapato for the first time. It says November 4th, Clark's first draft, he describes eating a round root near the size of a hen's eggs at a village past the mouth of what is now known as the Sandy River. The roots were roasted, simply roasted in the embers until they became soft. And here's the Sandy River. It is right before the city, or just to the east of the modern day Portland, and I put an X there. Presumably they were heading along the river when they stumbled across the village that had offered them this Wapato. And so November 7th, so now they've gone a few days farther, and they're invited into the home of these people. And Clark noted that their beds were along the walls about 4 feet above the ground level. This only gave them a foot of headspace along the wall, but it provided more storage space. And he noted that below their beds were baskets of dried fish, dried berries, and dried Wapato. And so I drew a little diagram of this. And so here's the bed frame. You can see it's elevated. You've got 4 foot is the height of a fully loaded pallet. That's what's under their bed, right? They've got these some kind of storage set up down there. And one of them has literal dried salmon jerky. One of them has dried berries. And one of them has literally dried potatoes, kind of like those dried potato flakes that you can buy at the grocery store, right? And that was the Wapato. And we already saw this quote, but I just want to point out again, Valerie Howard saying the Pacific, it's remarkable that the Pacific Coast tribes did not cultivate the soil since they were always on the verge of starvation. Does this look like they're on the verge of starvation? Probably they're not, and probably that's why they didn't start growing corn, right? And so Lewis and Clark note that the Wapato grew in great profusion on an island further downstream. They described the island as being 20 miles long, 5 to 10 miles wide, and it produced great quantities of this is Wapato, the bulb of which the natives called Wapato. They named this island Wapato Island, and they named this part of the lower Columbia Valley Wapato Valley from that root. And so this is the area that they called Wapato Valley. You can see the two rivers coming together. This is a low, wet area full of ponds and lakes and slow-moving water that would have been perfect for growing, indeed perfect for growing Wapato. You can see this was them on November 4th coming into this area. This is a close-up of the spot they called Wapato Island. And so you see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 villages on the island itself. They made different estimates over time about how many people were actually living on this island, somewhere between 800 and 1,800 people. And they have some descriptions of all these little towns. And just to show you this island where they were, this is modern day Portland, and that's the same island Lewis and Clark called Wapato Island. And so, this is just a thought thing from me, but, we have this common view of the Paleolithic, of these kind of scattered groups of hunter-gatherers living in nomadic bands, moving around. They're just sort of getting what they need from the earth on a kind of day-to-day basis. And so in some of these villages, Lewis and Clark saw these crates of dried salmon, which they said had 90 or 100 pounds of salmon in each crate. And it says in one village, Clark counted 107 stacks of these crates, 12 baskets per stack, amounting possibly to 10,000 pounds of dried salmon. And they also referred to procuring parcels or baskets of Wapato as well as bushels. So a bushel is about a 40-pound box. If we're talking about potatoes, Lewis and Clark presumably would have known that. They didn't record the standard weight of a basket of Wapato, but my point is when you see 10,000 pounds of dried salmon, this is serious storage. This is serious industry. And when we see these baskets of Wapato being traded around, this is a little bigger industry than a wandering group of nomads. And I showed you those villages. These are all people, Paleolithic people living settled lives, right? And so the chief occupation in a lot of this river was fishing and trading. They built these different kinds of canoes that were specialized for a specific purpose, such as hunting or sealing, right? I.e., hunting seals. And some of these were, all different sizes, but this one canoe they saw was 35 feet long and could carry a considerable amount of cargo. And also the finer canoes were painted red and had inlaid shells. And so this is the most singly interesting quote, I think, in the whole book. It says, from Willapa Bay to the mouth of the river steadily flowed large quantities of dried shellfish. And I'm going to show you where these places are on the map in a minute. These were arranged on sticks of salmonberry wood, each about 2 feet long. From the Qualhiaqua, the Willapa Bay people received furs of the larger animals and dried meat packed in tule bags. The Bay people furnished the Qualhiaqua with shellfish likewise, and again with goods received from the Columbia. Home products of the Columbia, the river, which were distributed in all directions, include dried salmon, pulverized salmon, dried smelt, dried seal meat, blubber, and canoes. Some of these products, especially blubber and canoes, were almost exclusively exports. The upriver groups brought, above all, Wapato and camas to the coastal people. These foods were highly prized on the coast and were imported in great quantities. And so you see, first of all, you see this wide trading network. Secondly, you see that the potatoes were highly prized by the people who had the salmon and the shellfish. And so this idea of are these potatoes really a fallback food if people are trading salmon and shellfish for them, right? And so I'm presenting this kind of another alternative look at the Paleolithic and what it sometimes was. You have local industries maximizing the local resources. So when they're talking about shellfish on salmonberry wood, that means that somebody needs to be collecting shellfish, somebody needs to be drying shellfish, someone needs to be pruning the salmonberry bushes to grow these specific 2-foot branches of wood that they use to put the shellfish on. Somebody needs to be making canoes. In the areas where they're growing Wapato, they also need someone to make baskets. They also are going to need canoes. In people in the middle of the river where they're catching salmon, they need a drying operation. They need crates to put the salmon in. Of course, everybody needs canoes. And in this alternative view of the Paleolithic, where people are not growing crops, everything is hunter-gathered, but you're focusing on sort of local industry and trade. You're going to have this thriving trade, of course, between the bioregions. And I'm also going to say that oftentimes you're going to have some amount of horticulture, which is, kind of like gardening, we'll call it. And this is that same area that they were just talking about. They said the people of Willapa Bay would bring the dried shellfish, right? And so this is Willapa Bay. And so these West Coast bays are great sources of oysters and clams and all kinds of other shellfish. And so these guys are up here drying shellfish. This is the main stem of the river from where a lot of the salmon would come from and seal. And this is Wapato Valley, right, where the potatoes are grown. And then you have people in the foothills, which are presumably bringing elk and things like berries and whatever they had. And then everybody is trading things with everybody so that everyone can have shellfish and salmon and elk and berries and potatoes, right? And so what's the kind of scale are we looking at? Well, downtown Portland to Long Beach, which is at the bottom of that bay, is a 2 hour drive, over a 2 hour drive in a car. So that's 111 miles. So this is, this is all happening on a kind of vast scale. Obviously in an era before cars, and they didn't even have horses. They did obviously have water transport. And so there's a couple estimates of the overall diets of this region. Hun estimated that they were eating 30% fish, 48% roots. So that means 48% Wapato, 12% fruits, and 10% small and large game. This other estimate is more like 50% fish and 29% roots. And so, who knows? The real answer is probably in the middle. Perhaps 40% of the calories in this area were provided by the Wapato. And there's a few other quotes, and now he's talking about the people along the sea or along the coast that are harvesting shellfish. He said they will dispose of their most valuable articles to obtain this root, to obtain these potatoes. So that to me doesn't sound like a fallback food. And this is another one near the mouth of the Columbia. The Corps traded again for Wapato and other roots. Clark noted that in this region, the Wapato root is scarce and highly valued by these people. This root they roast in hot ashes like a potato, and the outer skin peels off. On November 26th, he visited these other people in a village of 9 houses, and these were large community houses. So 9 houses might mean 200 or 300 people. They live on fish and elk and Wapato roots, of which he bought a few at high prices, right? Because these potatoes are very valuable. They're not serving a role as a fallback food. And I just said, don't forget seal. To note to myself to remember to point out that these people were also collecting seal meat, which I did. And so even with seal meat in hand, though, they still wanted the potatoes, right? And so, and this is just a slightly later person who came after Lewis and Clark. And again, he said it's these Wapato is a good. They resemble a small potato, for which is a good substitute when roasted or boiled. It has a very slight taste of bitterness and is highly esteemed by the natives, who collect vast quantities of it for their own use and for barter. And so that is my section on the Lower Columbia River and Wapato, and we're going to move on real quick and talk about sweet camas, which you've already heard mentioned. So camas is this other flower. I believe it's another lily. Two liliaceous root foods of the Northwest Coast Indians. And so this is kind of a map of all of the different people, and this is what this map is showing. The lower part of this area would be Seattle and also Vancouver in lower British Columbia and Canada, and Vancouver Island is the area that they're talking about. And it says these people also obtained camas bulbs from the Cowichan on the east coast of Vancouver Island using dried salmon in exchange. So this is a direct quote of people trading salmon for camas bulbs, this other root crop. Gunther notes for Western Washington that except for choice varieties of dried salmon, there was no article of food that was more widely traded than camas in the Seattle, Vancouver area. And I think this is a very interesting quote. Although camas sites were not actually farmed in the conventional sense, they were cultivated in much the same way as were patches of springbank clover and Pacific silverweed. Okay, so there's 2 other root crops they were eating by other coastal peoples. The sites were cleared of stones, weeds, and brush from year to year. Annual controlled burning was used to maintain an open prairie type habitat for optimum camas production. And remember, we talked about how controlled burns encourages species like lilies to regrow and to sprout. The turf was lifted out systematically in small sections and then replaced after only larger bulbs had been removed. The smaller bulbs were left intact to grow for the next season. And his informant said, the more you dig, the better it grows. And so that's very interesting, right? They knew how to maintain the stock of camas bulbs year after year so that they would have reliable production. And camas bulbs were almost always cooked before eating. This part is also super interesting. The traditional method of cooking was in a steaming pit. The size of the pit varied according to the quantity of bulbs to be cooked. But what they described was a circular 4 foot wide pit in the ground about 2 feet deep. So that's a massive hole. They would light a hot fire in the bottom. They would fill it with these rocks, these cobbles, until they were red hot. And then the ashes and unburned material were removed, leaving the hot stones in there. And they would put a layer of vegetation on top, and then they would fill it with the camas bulbs. The camas bulbs were poured on top. They would put another layer of vegetation, and then they would cover that with old mats and sand, and they would leave a hole left that they could pour water to generate steam, and they would be slowly steamed cooked by the retained heat in these hot earthen ovens. And it says the bulbs were usually allowed to cook for 24 or even 36 hours. Now, why did they do that? Why were the potatoes simply roasted and eaten, but these camas bulbs are cooked for 24 to 36 hours? And it says it is probable that lengthy cooking is necessary for maximum conversion of the inulin in the camas to fructose. And that's really interesting because, some tubers contain starch. Some tubers contain this other thing, which is kind of like starch, called inulin. And onions are high in inulin. And when you caramelize onions, the reason they get sweeter is that you're converting the inulin in the onions to fructose. And the Native Americans knew this, and they understood the difference between a camas bulb, which needed this long, slow cooking, and wapato, which you could just roast and eat, right? They knew the difference between inulin and starch. And they say, in contrast, rice root was sometimes eaten raw. When cooked, it was usually steamed or boiled for a short period of time. And so rice root is a starchy tuber, and they knew you didn't have to convert those starches. You could just quick roast them and eat them. And this fritillaria down here is the rice root, whose major carbohydrate component is reported to be starch. Would be expected to be more digestible in the raw state or with short-term cooking because it's not made of inulin. The inulin has to be converted to sugar. And furthermore, they would go on, once these camas balls were fully cooked like this, they would be fairly well preserved, but they could press them flat like biscuits. They made them into loaves. They stored them in baskets. So they had all kinds of ways to store and trade this camas. And when you hear people talk about them, the camas is very, very sweet. So this is sort of the dessert of the story. These were about 40% inulin by weight. And that inulin would be converted to fructose. And so, I saw one quote, like basically every white person who tried this camas loved it because it is this sweet treat. Unfortunately, I can't even read this slide. The people of this area were felled by multiple pandemics soon after Lewis and Clark's original voyage. And so there is not a lot of other firsthand evidence in these regions. So the great apes, the other, higher order primates and us, have very active salivary amylase. Homo sapiens have made use of high quality tubers since we've existed as a species. Evidence of tuber use followed the great human diaspora, right? And we saw that. We saw tuber use clearly starting in Africa. As humans moved into Europe, there is evidence of cattail processing. As they moved to China, there's evidence of yam processing. Lewis and Clark, when in this unique moment in time, witnessed a complex Paleolithic society based on geophytes, tubers, potatoes, whatever you want to call it, right? Furthermore, these Paleolithic people knew how to extract the maximum utility out of these geophytes, out of these corms. And you see, and the baking of the camas to convert the inulin to sugar is such a beautiful example of this. happening. And and the Paleolithic people also cultivated these crops. They knew they knew to selectively harvest only the largest tubers. They knew to burn the site to encourage the growth of new lilies, etc. And the level of knowledge and understanding displayed by Paleolithic peoples about how to make this all happen, how to process the tubers, how to get the most value out of them, how to make sure you have an annual crop, right? They knew what they were doing. None of this was an accident. And furthermore, the people in the American Pacific Northwest, by every account, as well as the Iroquois on the East Coast with their American groundnut, they valued Wapato and Camas very highly. These were not fallback foods. And so right, and so this was the episode that, like I say, I started out. I was going to talk about the metabolic advantages of starch, but this story, I think, about the history of tubers and humans is important and hasn't perhaps been told enough. A lot of the data that I showed, a lot of those studies are from like 2020 and 2021 of recent finds, of these archaeological finds of these ancient use of these bulbs and tubers. And so I thought it was important to do a whole episode on this topic. And I love talking about Native American foodways. So that's really fun. And anyways, I will get to in the next episode, still coming up. I'm going to talk about the metabolic and the redox benefits of starch consumption. So look forward to that. Thanks for listening.